Do you know that the wealthiest human being who has ever lived was not a tech billionaire, not an oil tycoon, not a European monarch, but a 14th century African king who was so extraordinarily rich that when he simply passed through a foreign country on his way to a religious pilgrimage, he accidentally destroyed that country's economy for the next 12 years. He did not invade it, he did not conquer it, he did not impose any taxes or sanctions or trade restrictions. He simply passed through, spending money as he went, giving gold away so generously, so casually, so freely. A man so wealthy that his generosity alone was an economic catastrophe. His name was Mansa Musa. He was the 10th emperor of the Mali Empire, at the time the largest empire in West Africa and one of the largest in the world. He ruled over more gold than any person in history before or since. And in 1324, he set out on a journey to Mecca that the world had never seen anything like and has never quite seen anything like since. This is the story of the richest human being who ever lived, and how his wealth was so incomprehensible that it changed the world simply by being spent. The world Mansa Musa inherited. To understand the scale of Mansa Musa's wealth and power, we need to understand the world he was born into, and specifically the empire he inherited. The Mali Empire at its height in the 14th century was one of the most powerful political entities on Earth. It stretched across approximately 2 million square kilometers of West Africa, an area larger than Western Europe, encompassing the modern nations of Mali, Senegal, Gambia, Guinea, Niger, Nigeria, Chad, and Mauritania. At its peak, it governed a population of between 40 and 60 million people, which represented approximately half of the entire population of the known world of that time. The Mali Empire's extraordinary wealth had a single source: gold. The empire sat directly above the Bambouk and Bouré gold fields, two of the richest gold deposits in the known world. Every gram of gold that passed through the trans-Saharan trade routes between West Africa and the Mediterranean world either came from Mali or passed through it. And because the medieval world ran on gold, because gold was the universal currency of trade from Europe to the Middle East to Asia, whoever controlled the gold controlled the economic pulse of the known world. Mali also controlled the salt trade. Salt was, in the medieval world, almost as valuable as gold. It was essential for food preservation, and in the sub-Saharan African context, it was literally traded pound for pound against gold. The Mali Empire sat at the intersection of the gold coming from the south and the salt coming from the north, taxing every transaction that passed through its territory. The result was a concentration of wealth so enormous that it defies any meaningful modern comparison. Economists who have attempted to calculate Mansa Musa's net worth in contemporary terms have produced figures ranging from 400 billion to over 4 trillion US dollars. The range is so wide because the truth is that his wealth was not really comparable to modern wealth at all. He did not merely own gold, he controlled the supply of gold for a significant portion of the known world. The man himself. Mansa Musa, Mansa being his title, meaning King of Kings or Emperor, came to the throne of Mali in 1312. He was not the first in line for the throne. He had been appointed as deputy to the previous emperor, Mansa Abu Bakr II, while Abu Bakr pursued what historians consider one of the most extraordinary and audacious plans in medieval history. Abu Bakr II had become obsessed with the question of what lay beyond the Atlantic Ocean. According to the 14th century Islamic scholar Ibn Khaldun, Abu Bakr organized an expedition of 2,000 boats, some carrying men, some carrying supplies, and sailed west into the Atlantic Ocean to find out what lay beyond the horizon. Not a single boat returned. Abu Bakr himself sailed with a second expedition of 1,000 boats and was never seen again. This was in approximately 1311, over a century and a half before Christopher Columbus crossed the Atlantic in 1492. Whether Abu Bakr's fleet reached the Americas, perished in the ocean currents, or met some other fate entirely is one of the great unsolved mysteries of medieval history. but it tells us something important about the intellectual and exploratory ambition of the Mali Empire that preceded Mansa Musa's reign. Mansa Musa inherited the throne when Abu Bakr sailed away and did not return. And unlike his predecessor, Mansa Musa's great ambition was not exploration, but administration, scholarship, and faith. He was a devout Muslim, deeply committed to the practice of Islam, genuinely learned in Islamic theology and law, and profoundly conscious of his duty as a Muslim ruler to support Islamic scholarship and make the pilgrimage to Mecca that every Muslim who is able is obligated to perform. By 1324, he was ready, and the pilgrimage he organized was unlike anything the medieval world had ever witnessed. The pilgrimage begins. The Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, is one of the 5 pillars of Islam, and every Muslim who is physically and financially able is required to perform it at least once in their lifetime. For Mansa Musa, the question was not whether he could afford to go. The question was how to go in a manner appropriate to his status as the most powerful ruler in West Africa. His answer was staggering. Mansa Musa assembled a pilgrimage caravan of approximately 60,000 people. Some accounts place the number even higher, up to 80,000. The caravan included 12,000 of his personal slaves, each dressed in fine silk and carrying a golden staff. It included 500 of his personal attendants, each carrying a golden staff weighing about 4 pounds. It included a personal retinue of soldiers, scholars, teachers, physicians, and administrators. It included hundreds of camels, each loaded with approximately 300 pounds of gold dust. The total amount of gold that Mansa Musa took with him on his pilgrimage has been estimated by historians at approximately 18 tons. 18 tons of pure gold being carried across the Sahara and through Egypt and Arabia on the backs of camels and the heads of slaves. The caravan stretched so far across the desert that it was impossible to see from one end to the other. It consumed entire oases as it passed through them. It required so much food that it transformed local markets along the entire route simply by its hunger. And everywhere it stopped, Mansa Musa gave gold away. Across the Sahara. The route from Mali to Mecca required Mansa Musa's caravan to cross the Sahara Desert, one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth, and then pass through the North African coastal cities before turning east toward the Arabian Peninsula. As the caravan moved through the Sahara, the impact on the communities it encountered was immediate and dramatic. Mansa Musa gave generously to every town and village he passed through. He built mosques wherever he stopped on a Friday, the Islamic day of communal prayer, reportedly constructing a mosque at every Friday prayer stop along the entire route. He distributed gold to the poor. He paid lavishly for food and supplies. He hosted feasts for local dignitaries. The trans-Saharan trade route had never seen anything like it. Merchants who encountered the caravan described it as a moving city, a community so large and so wealthy that it transformed every settlement it touched simply by its presence. By the time the caravan reached the North African coast and began moving east along the Mediterranean toward Egypt, word had spread ahead of it. People who had never heard of the Mali Empire, who had no concept of West African civilization or its wealth, were suddenly confronted with the reality of a ruler so powerful and so rich that his pilgrimage retinue was larger than the population of most of the cities he was about to visit. The Cairo Catastrophe. In the summer of 1324, Mansa Musa's caravan arrived in Cairo, the capital of the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt and one of the largest and most sophisticated cities in the medieval world. Cairo at this time was a city of approximately 500,000 people, a center of Islamic learning and culture, and the most important trading hub between Africa, the Mediterranean, and the Middle East. The arrival of Mansa Musa's caravan caused a sensation.
The Mamluk Sultan al-Nasir Muhammad received Mansa Musa with appropriate ceremony, and the two rulers exchanged gifts and courtesies. By all accounts, the diplomatic encounter was conducted with great sophistication on both sides. But it was what happened in Cairo's markets and streets that would have consequences lasting more than a decade. Mansa Musa spent lavishly in Cairo. He bought goods, paid for services, gave gifts, donated to mosques and religious institutions, and distributed gold to the poor with extraordinary generosity. His entourage did the same throughout the city. The amount of gold that entered Cairo's economy during the weeks of Mansa Musa's stay was so enormous, so far beyond anything the city had ever absorbed at once, that it fundamentally disrupted the basic economic mechanisms that made the city function. Gold, like any commodity, derives its value partly from its scarcity. When Mansa Musa's caravan flooded Cairo with gold, the scarcity disappeared. The value of gold in Egypt dropped sharply, and because gold was the basis of the currency and the pricing system for almost every transaction in the medieval Egyptian economy, prices across the board began to change in ways that hurt ordinary Egyptians severely. The price of goods rose dramatically. Merchants who had priced their wares in gold found that the gold they received was worth less than when they had set their prices. Inflation spread through the economy. The people who suffered most were not the wealthy merchants or the Mamluk officials. They had reserves to cushion the blow. The people who suffered most were ordinary Cairenes, workers, craftspeople, small traders, whose daily purchasing power was eroded by the sudden flood of gold that a foreign emperor had released into their city simply by being generous. Ancient records from Cairo describe the economic chaos that followed Mansa Musa's visit. Contemporary Egyptian scholars documented the price rises and the disruption of trade, and the damage was not quickly repaired. Historians who have studied the economic records of medieval Egypt have concluded that the gold market in Cairo did not fully recover for approximately 12 years after Mansa Musa's visit. 12 years of economic disruption from a man who was not trying to cause harm, who was simply doing what any generous, pious, wealthy ruler of his time would do on a religious pilgrimage, giving thanks to God through generosity to others.
The road to Mecca. From Cairo, Mansa Musa continued east toward the Arabian Peninsula and the holy city of Mecca. The journey from Cairo to Mecca across the Sinai Peninsula and along the Red Sea coast was itself a significant undertaking, but for a caravan the size of Mansa Musa's, it was an extraordinary logistical achievement. Along the route the pattern established in Cairo continued. Mansa Musa gave generously. He built and renovated mosques. He supported Islamic scholars and teachers. He distributed gold to the poor. When Mansa Musa finally arrived in Mecca and performed the Hajj, he did so with a devotion and a sincerity that impressed even those who were already deeply skeptical of the reports of his wealth that had preceded him. Contemporary accounts describe him as a man of genuine faith, not merely performing the rituals of the pilgrimage for political show, but deeply engaged in the spiritual dimensions of the journey. He spent time in Mecca and in Medina, the two holiest cities in Islam, studying, praying, and meeting with Islamic scholars from across the world. He used his wealth not just for display, but for investment in knowledge, taking scholars, teachers, architects, and poets back to Mali with him when he finally turned for home. Among those he brought back was a celebrated Andalusian architect and poet named Abu Ishaq al-Sahili, who would transform the architectural landscape of the Mali Empire with a distinctive style of mosque construction that can still be seen in West Africa today. The return and the borrowing. On the return journey from Mecca, something remarkable happened that reveals, perhaps better than anything else, just how extraordinary the scale of Mansa Musa's spending had been. He ran low on gold.
the man who had set out with 18 tons of gold, a quantity so enormous that it had destabilized the economy of medieval Egypt, had given away and spent so much of it along the way that by the time his caravan was making its way back through Egypt, he needed to borrow money to cover his expenses. He borrowed from Egyptian merchants at what ancient sources describe as very high interest rates, and he repaid those loans promptly and in full when he returned to Mali. But the detail itself is extraordinary. The wealthiest man in the world had temporarily run out of cash on a single trip. The borrowing episode has a second significance beyond the merely anecdotal. It tells us that the gold Mansa Musa had taken with him was not an insignificant fraction of his wealth. It was a deliberately selected portion, a pilgrimage fund assembled specifically for this journey. And even that selected portion, representing what he judged appropriate for the pilgrimage, was enough to destabilize the Egyptian gold market for 12 years. The mind struggles to process what the full extent of his wealth must have been. The map that changed the world. The impact of Mansa Musa's pilgrimage extended far beyond the economic disruption of Cairo's gold market. It had a second consequence that would prove even more historically significant. It put Mali on the map of the known world, literally. In 1375, approximately 50 years after Mansa Musa's pilgrimage, a Majorcan cartographer named Abraham Crescas produced what is now known as the Catalan Atlas, one of the most important maps of the medieval world, and a document that shaped European understanding of global geography for generations. On this map, in the region of West Africa where the Mali Empire was located, Crescas drew a seated African king wearing a golden crown and holding a golden scepter and a large golden orb. The figure was labeled Musa Meli, Musa of Mali, and the inscription beside him described him as the richest and most noble king in all the land, whose lands abound in gold. This was not merely a cartographic note, it was a declaration to every European ruler, merchant, and navigator who consulted the Catalan Atlas, and many did, that somewhere to the south and west, beyond the Sahara, there existed a kingdom of incomprehensible wealth, a kingdom whose king made European monarchs look modest by comparison. Historians have argued that Mansa Musa's appearance on the Catalan Atlas was one of the factors that eventually drove European interest in exploring the African coast, the long series of Portuguese expeditions down the Atlantic coast of Africa that began in the 15th century, and which eventually led to the European encounter with sub-Saharan Africa, the establishment of direct sea trade routes, and ultimately the devastating Atlantic slave trade. The richest man in history went on a pilgrimage, and the ripples of that journey shaped the course of the next 6 centuries. The Golden Kingdom. When Mansa Musa returned to Mali, he brought with him not just the spiritual fulfillment of the Hajj, but a new vision for what his empire could become. The scholars, architects, poets, and teachers he had recruited in Mecca and Medina became the foundation of a cultural renaissance that transformed the Mali Empire into one of the great centers of Islamic learning in the medieval world. The architect Abu Ishaq al-Sahili designed and built mosques and palaces in a distinctive style that blended North African and West African architectural traditions. The most famous of his buildings was the Jingareber Mosque in Timbuktu, a structure that still stands today, still functions as a place of worship, and is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Timbuktu itself, under Mansa Musa's patronage, became one of the most important cities of learning in the medieval world. At its height, the University of Sankore in Timbuktu had an enrollment of approximately 25,000 students, comparable to the University of Paris at the same period, and its libraries held hundreds of thousands of manuscripts on subjects from Islamic theology and law to mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and history.
The image of Africa that European colonizers would later use to justify their actions, the image of a continent without history, without learning, without civilization, was precisely and completely false for the West Africa of Mansa Musa's time. Timbuktu was a city of scholars, the Mali Empire was a state of laws, and Mansa Musa was a ruler of genuine intellectual cultivation and religious devotion.
The decline. Mansa Musa died sometime around 1337, approximately 13 years after his famous pilgrimage. The precise date and circumstances of his death are uncertain. Medieval West African historical records from this period are fragmentary, and the oral traditions that preserved much of Mali's history were disrupted by subsequent centuries of conflict and upheaval. The empire he left behind was still powerful, but the process of decline had already begun. The Mali Empire's fundamental vulnerability was the same that had always afflicted large empires with abundant natural resources. The wealth that made it powerful also made it attractive to rivals, and the sheer size of the territory made it difficult to defend from every direction simultaneously. In the decades following Mansa Musa's death, the empire faced increasing pressure from the Mosi kingdoms to the south, the Tuareg peoples of the Sahara to the north, and most fatally, from a rising power within, the Songhai Empire, centered on the city of Gao, which had been part of the Mali Empire, but which increasingly asserted its independence through the late 14th and early 15th centuries. By the late 15th century, around the time that Columbus was sailing west across the Atlantic in search of the Indies, the Mali Empire had been reduced to a fraction of its former territory. Timbuktu had been captured by the Songhai. The great gold fields were being contested by multiple powers. The empire that had once governed half the known world's population was contracting toward its original heartland. It was a pattern familiar from the history of every great empire: the peak of achievement followed by the slow or rapid unraveling, the successor states, the contested resources, the eventual absorption into new political formations. The Mali Empire did not disappear overnight, it faded, and as it faded, the memory of what it had been, of the extraordinary civilization that had produced Mansa Musa, faded with it in the consciousness of the wider world.
The Forgotten Giant. For centuries after the decline of the Mali Empire, Mansa Musa and the civilization he represented were largely absent from the historical narratives taught in schools and universities around the world. The reasons for this are not mysterious. They reflect the broader erasure of African history that accompanied European colonial expansion and the ideological frameworks that were constructed to justify it. But the erasure was never complete. The manuscripts of Timbuktu survived, hundreds of thousands of them, preserved by families and scholars across the centuries, hidden during times of conflict, passed down through generations who understood their value even when the outside world did not. The Jingareber Mosque still stands. The oral traditions of the Mande peoples kept the memory of Mansa Musa alive even when written records were unavailable. And in the 20th and 21st centuries, historians and archaeologists have been gradually reconstructing the full picture of what the Mali Empire was and what Mansa Musa achieved. The manuscripts of Timbuktu have been cataloged and digitized, a project that has revealed the extraordinary breadth and depth of West African scholarship in the medieval period. Archaeological work at the sites of the great Mali cities has confirmed and expanded the picture provided by medieval written sources. What that picture shows is a civilization that deserves to be known, not as a footnote to someone else's history, but as one of the great human achievements of the medieval world, a civilization that produced the richest human being who ever lived, one of the greatest centers of learning the medieval world had ever seen, and a cultural legacy that still shapes West Africa today.
What Mansa Musa tells us. The story of Mansa Musa is not just the story of a very rich man. It is the story of what wealth actually means when it exists at a scale that the ordinary human mind cannot process.
Mansa Musa's wealth was not abstract. It was not numbers on a spreadsheet or valuations of stock portfolios. It was physical gold, flowing through a physical landscape, touching physical communities, changing physical lives. His pilgrimage tells us something profound about the relationship between wealth and impact. A man who intended only good, who set out to fulfill a religious obligation and to express his gratitude through generosity, caused 12 years of economic hardship for the people of Cairo through no malicious intent whatsoever. The disruption was not punishment, it was consequence. The consequence of wealth so concentrated that its movement through the world could not help but reshape whatever it touched. And his legacy tells us something equally profound about the relationship between civilization and memory. The Mali Empire at its height was one of the great human achievements in history. That it was forgotten for centuries, or rather deliberately made to be forgotten, does not change what it was. It only tells us about the priorities and prejudices of those who controlled the narratives of history. We are still recovering the full story, and the full story, as it emerges, is extraordinary. The wealthiest human being who ever lived was not from Europe. He was not from Asia. He was an African king who ruled an empire that most of the world had never heard of, and whose generosity alone was enough to crash the economy of one of the greatest cities in the medieval world for 12 years. His name was Mansa Musa. He ruled the Mali Empire. He went on a pilgrimage. He put Africa on the map of the world, literally. And the ripples of that journey are still being felt 700 years later. History is never boring when you know where to look, and it is never as simple as we were taught. If this changed how you see the ancient world, share this video with someone who needs to know. Subscribe to Ancient Curios and hit the notification bell so you never miss a fact that history forgot to tell you. New episodes every week. I will see you in the next one.